For most of us today, the Pope is the ultimate spiritual leader of the Christian world, a symbol of faith and moral guidance for millions. But history, as we know, is never that simple. The past often hides stories that challenge the pristine image we see today. Let's travel back in time, to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Back then, the papacy wasn't just a religious office. It was one of the most powerful political positions in all of Europe. The Pope controlled vast lands, commanded armies, and held a treasury that could rival any kingdom. Kings and emperors trembled at the thought of displeasing Rome, because a single decree from the Pope could topple thrones and redraw the map of the continent. With so much power at stake, it is no surprise that the papal throne attracted men who were more interested in earthly authority and wealth than in spiritual salvation. Over the centuries, the Vatican wasn't just a place of prayer. It became a hotbed of political intrigue, family ambition, and scandalous behavior. Of course, there were many popes who were devout reformers, men who fought to guide the church toward honesty and discipline. But there were others whose actions shocked even the people of their own time. Their personal lives seemed to stand in stark opposition to the very moral teachings they were sworn to uphold. And you can bet those stories spread like wildfire. Travelers, priests, and diplomats would whisper in hushed tones about what was really happening behind the Vatican's gilded walls. Some of these rumors were surely exaggerated for dramatic effect, but many were backed up by letters, reports, and eyewitness accounts that have survived to this day. One of the biggest issues was how popes were chosen. In theory, it was a sacred process, guided by the Holy Spirit. But in reality, powerful and wealthy families often used bribes and backroom deals to make sure one of their own relatives ended up on St. Peter's throne. These practices, known as nepotism, became rampant. Unseen power, some of these popes treated the church not as a spiritual institution, but as their personal family empire. They handed out the most important and lucrative positions to their nephews and cousins, controlled immense fortunes, and forged alliances through strategic marriages and secret pacts. This system deeply tarnished the church's reputation, creating a crisis of faith that simmered just beneath the surface. Life inside the papal court was a world away from the simple, pious life preached to the common folk. The Vatican buzzed with activity, filled with diplomats, soldiers, artists, scholars, and nobles from across Europe. Grand feasts that lasted 4 days were common. Political strategies were plotted late into the night, and alliances were made and broken over glasses of the finest wine. Immoral, the Renaissance Vatican, felt less like a monastery and more like the royal court of an ambitious and powerful king. This environment was a breeding ground for rumors of immoral behavior. Critics of the church claimed that some of its highest leaders had completely forgotten their spiritual duties. One of the most shocking accusations that circulated during this period involved the alleged mistreatment of those who had taken the strictest vows of all. Nuns in medieval Europe lived under incredibly strict rules. They vowed poverty, obedience, and chastity, dedicating their entire lives to prayer and service within the walls of a convent. These convents were seen as sacred havens, but critics of the Renaissance papacy claimed that some powerful church officials abused their authority over these religious communities, violating the very trust they were meant to protect. Such accusations sent waves of outrage through the faithful. The church was supposed to be the guardian of the devout, not their exploiter. And at the center of many of these scandals was one man, a pope whose name still sparks intense debate among historians. He hailed from one of the most ambitious and ruthless families in all of Europe. His relatives were powerful, fabulously wealthy, and deeply entangled in the bloody political struggles of Italy. When he finally became pope, many whispered that his election was bought with a fortune in silver and a string of political promises, not earned through spiritual merit. His rise to power marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic and controversial chapters in the Vatican's long history. At first, there was a glimmer of hope. Many prayed that he would be the strong leader needed to unite the church and bring stability back to Rome. But as the years went by, unsettling reports began to leak from his court. Ambassadors wrote secret letters back to their home countries, describing extravagant parties, shocking behavior, and a court consumed by luxury. Rival families, eager to seize power for themselves, spread stories accusing him of every kind of corruption and moral hypocrisy imaginable. Now, it's true that some of these accusations were likely political propaganda, designed to weaken his authority. But many other reports came from sources that historians still consider credible today, painting a disturbing picture of his reign. The image of the papacy became fractured. To his supporters, he was a strong, effective ruler, and the stories were nothing more than slanderous attacks by the enemies of the church. To his critics, he was the ultimate proof that the highest religious office in Christendom had become corrupted by worldly power. Meanwhile, ordinary people across Europe went about their daily lives, mostly unaware of the high-stakes drama unfolding in Rome. They tilled their fields, raised their families, and prayed for salvation, placing their trust in a church whose leaders were engaged in a dangerous game of thrones. But inside the Vatican, and in universities and monasteries across the continent, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Religious reformers began to speak out, warning that if the church didn't cleanse itself of this corruption, it would face a catastrophic crisis of faith. Priests and scholars argued that the church needed to return to its spiritual roots, to focus on salvation instead of wealth and power. These warnings were not well received by those in charge. Many reformers were silenced, facing criticism, excommunication, or even worse, for daring to speak truth to power. But their ideas couldn't be contained. They spread through secretly printed pamphlets, passionate sermons, and hushed conversations, planting the seeds of a revolution that would soon shake the foundations of Europe. The story of this controversial pope would become one of the most debated episodes in church history. For some, he represents the absolute peak of corruption in the Renaissance papacy. For others, he is a more complex figure, a victim of his time whose reputation was deliberately blackened by his political enemies. But one thing is certain: the events of his reign sent shockwaves across Europe and played a crucial role in triggering one of the most significant turning points in Christian history. The scandals, the ambition, and the clash between spiritual duty and earthly power created a perfect storm. Next time, we will delve deeper into the story of this notorious figure. We'll explore how his family schemed their way to the top, how he secured the papal throne, and why his family name became one of the most feared and infamous in all of Renaissance Europe. The rise of this pope reveals just how dangerously power, ambition, and religion can become when they are intertwined in the very heart of the Vatican. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter of this incredible story. Far from the gilded halls of Rome, in the year 1431, a child was born in Spain who would one day shake the very foundations of the church. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, and his family was already a force to be reckoned with, powerful, wealthy, and fiercely ambitious. But it was his uncle, a high-ranking church leader who would become Pope Calixtus III, who held the key to his destiny. This single family connection would catapult young Rodrigo from the Spanish nobility straight into the heart of the Vatican. In Renaissance Rome, who you knew was everything. When his uncle took the papal throne, Rodrigo was summoned. He was still a young man when he was made a cardinal, joining the elite circle that advised the Pope and governed the church. The Vatican back then was a viper's nest of political intrigue. Kings, nobles, and rival families all vied for influence, and every decision could shift the balance of power across Europe. Rodrigo wasn't just a survivor in this world. He thrived. He was intelligent, charming, and a master of political maneuvering. He formed strategic alliances, cultivated relationships with the powerful, and quickly built a reputation as a brilliant administrator. For decades, he served as the vice-chancellor of the church, one of the most powerful administrative roles in the entire institution. This position gave him control over the church's vast finances and political dealings, and with it, he amassed an obscene fortune. Palaces, lands, and treasures flowed through the Vatican, making Rodrigo Borgia one of the wealthiest men in a city of riches. But with immense power and wealth came temptation. Whispers and stories began to circulate about his lifestyle. Critics claimed he lived more like a secular prince than a man of God, indulging in luxurious feasts, extravagant clothes, and the company of powerful nobles. His opulent palace became a vibrant hub of Roman society, where politics, art, and ambition swirled together. But the rumors went deeper. Despite the vows of celibacy expected of church leaders, it was an open secret that Rodrigo had mistresses and had fathered several children. This was a scandal that shocked many of the faithful. Among his children were two who would become legends in their own right. Cesare Borgia, a name that would become synonymous with ruthless ambition, and Lucrezia Borgia, a woman whose life would be shrouded in both admiration and dark mystery. While these stories spread, Rodrigo's influence only grew. Popes came and went, but Cardinal Borgia remained a constant, powerful force in Rome. He knew the system inside and out, patiently building support among his fellow cardinals. Then, in 1492, the moment he had been working towards for decades finally arrived. De Popidi, then the cardinals gathered in a conclave to elect a successor. In theory, this was a sacred process guided by the Holy Spirit. In reality, it was often a hotbed of political deal-making and bribery. Cardinals secretly negotiated, trading votes for promises of wealth, land, and power. Rodrigo Borgia entered this conclave with more resources and more allies than anyone else. After days of intense negotiation, the white smoke rose. Rodrigo Borgia had been elected the new pope. He took the name Alexander VI. For some, his election was the logical conclusion of a long and successful career, but for others, it was a worrying sign. They saw the papacy becoming dangerously entangled with worldly ambition and family politics. Still, Rome erupted in celebration. Festivals, parades, and ceremonies welcomed the new leader, who promised to strengthen the church and protect its authority. However, it didn't take long for the controversy to begin. Almost immediately, members of the Borgia family were elevated to powerful positions. A young Cesare Borgia was given a high rank in the church, and other relatives were showered with titles and influence. This was nepotism on a scale that stunned even seasoned observers. The papal court itself became legendary for its visitors wrote home with breathless descriptions of lavish banquets and opulent parties that rivaled those of any king in Europe. Rome flourished as a center of Renaissance art and culture. But behind the dazzling facade, darker rumors continued to fester. Some church officials began to worry aloud that the popist lifestyle was damaging the reputation of the papacy. The leader of the Christian world, they argued, should embody humility and spiritual discipline, not princely excess. At the same time, Alexander VI plunged headfirst into the turbulent politics of Italy. The peninsula was a patchwork of competing city-states, and foreign powers like France and Spain were constantly meddling. The Pope acted more like a political monarch than a spiritual guide, forging alliances, breaking treaties, and dispatching armies. In this climate of intrigue, the stories of moral scandals grew louder and more specific. Enemies of the Borgia family, and there were many, spread accusations of secret, depraved acts happening within the Vatican walls. While some of these tales were likely exaggerations spun by political rivals, the sheer volume of them created a thick atmosphere of suspicion. Across Europe, reformers were beginning to point to Rome as a symbol of everything wrong with the church. They called for a return to a simpler, more spiritual faith. But within the Vatican, the Borgias were consolidating their power. With his father's blessing, Cesare Borgia shed his cardinal's robes and became a full-fledged military commander. He led papal armies across Italy, conquering cities, crushing enemies, and carving out a kingdom for his family. This fusion of religious authority and raw military force was shocking. The papacy had always been a political player, but under Alexander VI, the line between the cross and the sword seemed to have vanished completely. Meanwhile, the whispers about the personal lives of the Borgias never ceased. Stories passed between diplomats, merchants, and pilgrims, painting a picture of a papal court where moral chaos reigned. Historians still debate the truth of the most extreme accusations, but the damage to the Borgia papacy's reputation was already done. People everywhere were asking troubling questions. How could the church claim moral authority when its own leaders seemed to live like corrupt princes? How could ordinary believers trust a system so consumed by wealth and political ambition? These questions were the first tremors of an earthquake that would soon shake Christianity to its core. For now, Pope Alexander VI ruled Rome with an iron fist, secure in his power and surrounded by his family. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. Reformers were watching. Critics were writing, and the reputation of the church was slowly, irrevocably changing. The reign of the Borgia Pope was setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation, one that would challenge the authority of the papacy and change the course of history forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more dives into the most compelling chapters of history. See you next time. As the years passed, the rule of Pope Alexander VI continued to shape the atmosphere inside Rome. The city was becoming one of the most powerful centers of politics and culture in Europe. Artists, scholars, and merchants arrived from many lands, hoping to gain favor at the papal court. But alongside the beauty and creativity of the Renaissance, darker stories continued to spread through the streets and across the borders of Europe. Ambassadors from foreign kingdoms lived in Rome and carefully watched everything happening inside the Vatican. Their job was to send detailed reports back to their kings and queens. Many of these letters have survived, and they describe a court that was both powerful and deeply controversial. Some ambassadors wrote that Alexander VI ruled the church with great political skill. He knew how to negotiate with powerful rulers, how to protect the interests of Rome, and how to keep control over difficult situations. But other observers believed something very different. They believed the papacy had become too focused on power, wealth, and family ambition. According to these critics, the spiritual responsibilities of the church were no longer the main priority. At the center of these concerns was the influence of the Borgia family. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son, was becoming one of the most feared figures in Italy. At first, he had been given a high position inside the church, but Cesare did not want to live the life of a priest. He wanted power, command, and military glory. Eventually, he left his religious position and became a military leader. With the support of his father, he began leading armies across parts of Italy. Cities that resisted Borgia rule often faced harsh consequences. Rival leaders disappeared, alliances were broken, and territories changed hands through force. Many people across Italy began to fear the growing power of the Borgia family. Meanwhile, inside Rome, life at the papal court continued with great luxury. The Vatican Palace hosted large gatherings where nobles, artists, and political leaders met. These events were often filled with music, food, and displays of wealth. Some visitors admired the energy and culture of the court. Others believed that the lifestyle they witnessed was far removed from the humble traditions of the church. Stories about the behavior of certain officials began to circulate widely. Monks, priests, and scholars who believed strongly in reform began speaking more openly about the need for change. They argued that church leaders must return to discipline and spiritual responsibility. Some reformers warned that if corruption continued, it could damage the faith of ordinary believers. At the same time, rumors connected to religious communities also appeared in letters and writings from the period. Convents were supposed to be places of prayer and protection, where women who chose a religious life could live peacefully under the guidance of church authority. However, critics sometimes accused powerful figures of interfering in the lives of these communities. It is important to understand that many of these stories were influenced by political rivalries. During the Renaissance, powerful families often used rumors and accusations to weaken their enemies. Enemies of the Borgia family spread many dramatic claims in an attempt to destroy their reputation. Because of this, historians today must carefully examine each story, comparing different sources to understand what may have truly happened. Some accounts from the time describe moments where the authority of the papal court was used in ways that troubled many believers. Religious leaders were expected to serve as examples of discipline and moral responsibility. When people believed that these expectations were not being followed, it created anger and disappointment. Travelers visiting Rome sometimes described the city as a place where religion and politics were deeply intertwined. Decisions about war, alliances, and power were often discussed within the same walls, where religious ceremonies were performed. For some observers, this mixture of spiritual authority and political ambition felt dangerous. Yet Alexander VI continued to rule with confidence. He strengthened alliances, negotiated with powerful kings, and tried to maintain the influence of the papacy across Europe. His supporters argued that he was protecting the power of Rome during a very unstable time. Italy was filled with rival states such as Florence, Venice, Milan, and Naples. Foreign powers like France and Spain were constantly trying to gain influence in the region. In this complicated environment, the Pope was not only a religious leader but also a political ruler who had to protect his territory. But the rumors surrounding the Borgia court did not disappear. Writers and critics across Europe began recording stories about the behavior of powerful church officials. Some of these writings were filled with anger and frustration. They believed the church had lost its way. At the same time, other voices defended the papacy. They argued that many of the accusations were exaggerated by enemies who wanted to weaken the church. The truth likely existed somewhere between these two sides. What cannot be denied is that the reputation of the papacy during this time became deeply controversial. Even centuries later, Historians continued to debate how much of the scandal was real and how much was shaped by political propaganda. But regardless of the exact truth, the damage to the church's image was growing. Across Europe, people began discussing the need for reform. Priests, scholars, and ordinary believers started asking questions about the direction of the church. They wondered whether spiritual leadership had become too connected with wealth and power. These questions did not disappear after the rule of Alexander VI. Instead, they slowly grew stronger over the next decades. Writers began publishing books criticizing corruption inside the church. Religious leaders called for a return to humility and discipline. Some demanded that church authorities investigate the behavior of powerful figures. The growing frustration would eventually lead to one of the most important transformations in Christian history. But during the final years of Alexander VI's rule, the Vatican still appeared powerful from the outside. Rome remained a center of art, culture, and diplomacy. The Borgia family continued to hold influence, and their ambitions seemed far from finished. Yet history often moves in unexpected ways. Events were approaching that would suddenly change the balance of power in Rome. And when those events arrived, the legacy of Alexander VI and the Borgia family would face a dramatic and uncertain future. In the next part of this story, we will explore how the final years of the Borgia papacy unfolded, and how the growing calls for reform began to reshape the future of the church.